Okay, so we're talking today about elements of plot, and what I want you guys to do is I'm going to tell you what to put in your comp books, but you're going to want to have this diagram in your composition book. This is going to be an important diagram that we're going to be using over the next few weeks. So first, looking at the diagram, we have kind of it's almost like a pyramid, not quite though. It starts with the introduction. Now the introduction, this is very important, class. The introduction is where we are introducing the setting and the characters. And I'm going to define all these terms for you in a few minutes. But setting and characters. Setting is the time and location. In any kind of fictional story, remember that fiction is a story that is not true. Any fictional story, there's always a setting, usually nonfiction too. But there's a setting, time, and location. Most authors will tell you where it is and when it is. Sometimes they'll only give you part of that, depending on the length of the story. If it's a short story, maybe it's just going to give you time, or maybe it'll just give you a location, but you have one of those two things. It's also where we introduce the characters, and there are a couple of different types of characters that we're going to go over in a few minutes. That's the introduction of a story. That's usually what happens first. Then as we begin to rise towards the top there, we have what's called rising action. And in rising action is when we have things called the conflict. Well, the conflict, and like I said, I'm going to define these for you in a moment for your notes, but is, sorry, I'm brain farted there. The conflict is the main problem of the story. It's the main problem of the story. Every story has something that has to be overcome. It may not necessarily a bad thing, it could be a good thing, but it's always a problem that needs to be overcome by somebody in the story. Along the way towards rising action as well is the complications. Complications are those kinds of events that occur that make solving the conflict more challenging. A lot of times you're going to find that one character is trying to solve the conflict and another one is creating complications. And you're going to see the terms for those, that's protagonist and antagonist, in a moment. Eventually, as rising action commences, we reach what's called the climax. Now, the climax is the turning point. That's when pretty much most of the action has occurred already. Pretty much the entire conflict has been resolved. There may be a few things to wrap up still, but the climax is the turning point of the story. And then we have what's called falling action. This is where everything begins to wrap up and move towards conclusion. And finally, we have what's called resolution, or this fancy French word that you may not know how to pronounce. It's pronounced denouement. Denouement. It is another way of saying resolution. You're going to see the reason why I throw that term on here is you're going to see this term used more and more as you get older and older. So high school, college, they'll use the term denouement more than they will use the term resolution. Okay, so you need to know the word. I don't need you to know how to pronounce it yet. You will eventually figure out the appropriate usage of the word, but in this class, we'll probably generally refer to it as the resolution. Okay, so hopefully you have this diagram in your notes, because that's going to be very important. If you haven't put them in your notes, and I'm looking around the room and seeing a lot of you haven't even put anything on the page at all yet, so that's interesting as well. But let me go ahead now and give you some definitions, and then I'll go back here and show you this again at the end. So we have, so first of all, these are all going to need to be in your notes as well. I'm going to give you plenty of time to write down, don't worry. So I'll make sure you know what the terms are. I've already kind of described the terms as we went along, but you need to listen. And first of all, I told you at the introduction, the beginning of the plot line is where we have our characters and setting. And here's the thing about characters. This is important, and I want you to know this. A character is anything in a story that has what I call voice. And what I mean by voice is it can think or it can speak. Okay? If something in a story can think or speak, it has voice, which makes it a character. So in fiction, just about anything in fiction can be a character. A tree can be a character if it can think or if it can speak. So that's really important. Most of the time, your characters are going to be human characters or maybe animal characters. In fact, the story we're going to be reading is full of animal characters. They all have voice because they can all think and they can all speak. Okay, so that's what makes it a character. A character is the voice. It isn't the kind of thing that it is. The setting, I remember I told you this a moment ago, the setting is the time and place that the story occurs. Generally speaking, you're going to find this in every story. The conflict is the main problem. This is where the term protagonist comes in. And this is a term I'm going to want you to know. Protagonist. It's pretty much the main character, but it could be one of the main characters. It's the most important character in the story. It doesn't mean it's a good or a bad character, so don't be confused by this prefix, pro. Don't be confused by those prefixes. It doesn't mean necessarily a good character. It could be a bad character. It could be evil. It could be good. It just depends on the story itself. But the protagonist is the main character. And he or she is the person that has to solve the conflict. So whatever the conflict is, it's inside that person. They have to solve it. Okay. The antagonist, on the other hand, is another main character who is creating the problem. Okay. Again, don't be confused by the anti prefix. It doesn't mean bad. It just means they're on the other side of the story. They're creating the problem, or they could be creating conflicts or complications. Um, that's the antagonist, and their main role is to bring out more and more problems and make things harder to solve. So this takes us to complications. Again, all part of rising action. There are problems that arise in a story that make resolving the conflict more difficult. Every story will have a conflict, and they will all have some sort of complications, making things more challenging. Okay, this is all part of rising action, which is all the events in the story that lead towards the climax, which takes us to climax, the high point or turning point of a story. This is where most of the problems have been solved. We've reached pretty much the end of action in the story, and now we're moving towards resolution. But this is the high point. It's not always easy to identify the climax, so you need to be kind of aware of this. I'm going to be asking you this on the story we're going to be reading, where the climax is. And some of you will give me the right one, some of you will give me a different one. So it's just a matter of knowing where the turning point is in the story. And it could be very, very close to the end. You never know. So keep that in mind. Then this is all part of what's called falling action, everything moving towards resolution or the denouement. And the resolution is the final resolution, the ending of the story, when everything is wrapped up and the story is not over. Okay. The interesting thing about resolution is that not every story has a very good resolution. Most of the time, they do. But if it's a series of books, like Harry Potter or Twilight series or any of those kind of series of books, they don't always have a resolution to the entire story. So they don't wrap up all of the threads and all of the details that are involved. So, and that can be kind of frustrating for people who are reading. Like, I want to know what happened next, and they got to read the next book. So, but resolution will occur even in a series, but usually at the very end of the series. Every story has a resolution. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this chart here. Make sure this is in your notes, please. I'm going to give you a few seconds to do this, and then I will go back to the other one and make sure those terms are defined as well in your notes. Any questions?